Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to Choosing to Lead. My name is Megan DeRogers, and I am the president and CEO at 100 Miles. We are a nonprofit organization located in coastal Georgia with a mission of protecting and preserving Georgia's 100-mile coast through advocacy, education, and citizen engagement. Tonight is the fourth of 5 conversations we are hosting this year as part of our digital Choosing to Lead conference. None of these conversations would be possible without the support of our generous sponsors. Thank you, Southern Ionics Minerals, Rayonier Advanced Materials, Cumberland Island Conservancy, and our many nonprofit partners for making our 2021 conference possible. We encourage all of our participants to visit our virtual exhibit hall, where you can learn more about our sponsors and their work. Georgia's coast is an ecological wonder of the world because of our amazing natural resources and this is very important, the efforts that have been undertaken to protect them. Tonight, I'm talking to you from the middle of our coast. About 1 mile due east of my house is a vast salt marsh that is 5 to 8 miles wide at any given point, and part of a Georgia ecosystem that contains 33% of the remaining salt marsh in the entire eastern United States. This salt marsh system supports a wide array of amazing wildlife and offers important ecosystem services like flood protection. As we make important and necessary adjustments to our lives to adapt to climate change and sea level rise, our salt marsh is an example of one of the natural resources that both protects us and requires our protection. We've come a long way since the first Earth Day 51 years ago, which also happens to be the same year that Georgia passed our Salt Marsh Protection Act. A lot has changed, including our awareness, our leaders, and much about our society. In some ways, the change that has occurred for the better, and in some ways it's occurred for the worse. This evening, Bill McKibben and Brionté McCorkle are going to have a conversation around the question of how we can save our future. They will talk about how far we have come and where this movement needs to go. Not just this movement, where our world, our society, where our leaders, where we all need to go if we are to adequately prepare for the impacts of climate change and the other environmental threats that we face. Bill McKibben has been involved in the environmental movement for more than 3 decades. He is perhaps the most well-known environmentalist of our modern era, and he works across sectors to compel change as an author and an advocate. Brionté McCorkle is the executive director of the Georgia Conservation Voters. She's been a climate activist and an advocate for racial and environmental justice. And in addition to working with candidates on elections, she has also been a candidate for political office herself. In 2017, she ran as a candidate for Atlanta City Council. Unfortunately, our third speaker, Delaney Reynolds, was not able to join us this evening. I'm thrilled to be here with you tonight. There are more than 500 people registered for this conversation, and I'm also thrilled to be with these 2 heroes. This is going to be an interactive session. Brionté has questions for Bill, but she is also going to be threading your questions into their conversation, so I urge you to participate. Please add your questions to the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll answer as many as possible throughout the evening. Thank you for being here tonight. I hope you enjoy this session.
Hey, so it's on to me and you, Bill, on to me and you. It's good to see you. Again, with your Climate Feminist sweater, I'm like, where do I get one of those? Okay.
I'll tell you where. This is a relic of this wonderful book that came out this year, All You Can Save, with essays by 40 or 50 leading women climate activists and scientists and things. And I think they're selling these to raise money. I need it because it's cold here in Vermont tonight. So.
Well, okay, got it. Actually, that book is on my shelf right now, All We Can Save. And it's definitely, we're going through a warm snap in Georgia. It'll be cold in a day or 2, but that's just how it goes this season. Great. Well, it sounds like you and I are going to solve the most pressing problem, climate change. How do we save our future? We have all the answers today, Bill, you and I. But I'll start with just one first question, because it is a big topic, and it's going to take a lot for us to address environment and climate. And of course, addressing those will make a big difference for what life on this planet looks like for the decades ahead. So I want to start with my first question, which is what compelled you to get involved in the environmental movement and what keeps you in the movement?
Well, those are both good questions, and thank you for them, and thank you for being here. Can I just start by saying two things that I'm thinking about tonight, just as we
Go ahead.
begin?
Yeah.
The first one is, I'm quite cognizant that we're a year on today from the day that Ahmaud Arbery got shot, and um, and I was thinking about that. I go out every single day here. It's a big part of my life to be able to go out and ski through the woods around here, just out the back door for my exercise and things. And the thought of even having to think about whether some idiot with a gun was going to come after me while I'm doing it has never even crossed my mind. And so I mean, we've got huge challenges, and we're going to talk about the climate challenge tonight. But part of this is just building a world where everybody is able to just be out in it and be able to do it without worry. And that seems like such a bottom line thing to begin. Um, the second thing I would just say is to you, uh, many, many, many thanks to you and everybody else who worked this last election. Turned out that Georgia was the key of all keys, and that you guys managed to turn the key and unlock some real chance at political power. We're having a very different conversation tonight than we would have been if you guys hadn't rounded up the last 20, 30,000 votes for Reverend Warnock and for Mr. Ossoff. And so uh, I know it was incredible labor that everybody took on down there. And I just, it turns out to have been incredibly important in many ways, including on this most existential of issues. And it seems completely weird to think that the fate of issues about the whole world could, turn on turning out a few thousand people in the Atlanta suburbs or in downtown Savannah or something. But there you are. So many, many, many thanks for your good work. I got into all this because not for any great reason, except that I was a young journalist. And my 20s, I was working at the New Yorker. And um, and I'd written a long piece for the New Yorker about where everything in my apartment at the corner of Bleecker and Broadway, where it all came from. So I'd gone down to Brazil to look at Con Ed was buying oil from Brazil. So I was out in the jungle at oil wells, and I was up in Hudson Bay because they were getting hydropower from up there, and along the water supply system, and out with the barges that were dumping the garbage, and on and on and on. And that piece that I wrote for the New Yorker, I think was important for me because it helped me, reminded me that the world is a physical place, which sounds like a weird thing to say. Of course, the world's a physical place, but I mean, if you grow up in a suburb as I did, the suburb is, sort of a machine designed to hide the operations of the actual world from you. Who knows where the water comes from, where the river goes, And now we live in a world where we spend most of our time staring into screens, so physical reality is easy to miss. And I think because I was focused on the understanding all of a sudden just how fragile even something as rich and powerful as New York City is in kind of physical terms, how dependent on the continued normal operation of the earth, I was very primed to be reading the early climate science in the 1980s in the various journals and taking it seriously. And so I ended up writing the first book about all this, a book called The End of Nature that came out in 1989, so long before you were born. And it was, and I've spent the subsequent decades, engaged in this fight. I've been in it as long as it's been a public fight. And and uh, it took me a while, and I kind of curse myself sometimes for it. It took me a good 10 years to figure out that it was a fight. Like I had thought, because I was a writer, uh, that we were in an argument. And so the job was to write more books and have more symposiums and, articles and people give. I mean, and eventually the weight of evidence would be so high that our leaders would do what they should, because why wouldn't they? The scientists had issued a clear warning. The worst thing that was ever going to happen in the world was about to happen. Maybe they'd take action. And it took me a while to figure out that we'd won the argument. By the mid 1990s, there was ironclad scientific consensus about what was going on. We were just losing the fight because the fight wasn't about data and reason. The fight was what fights are always about: money and power, And so we had to start building some power. And that's the point where I started sort of combining writing and all of that with attempts at movement building. Now, I still am a rank amateur at it compared to you, but we got, we got this thing called 350.org going about 15 years ago. That was the first iteration of a kind of global climate movement. And happily now there's lots of, there's Extinction Rebellion and the wonderful Sunrise Movement and the incredible, Fridays for the Future, Greta Thunberg, big global camp crusade of junior high and high school students. And there's all kinds of action. And finally, we've got a certain amount of power to stack up against the wealth and influence of the fossil fuel industry. So that's how I got into it. And what keeps me going is watching that movement build and watching it diversify and watching over the last 10 years, really, it turn into the kind of climate justice movement with people from frontline communities and indigenous communities very much at the kind of head of it. And it's very exciting to watch that. I don't know whether we started in time or not. And as I say, I sometimes kick myself, but at least the fight is on now.
Yeah, so much. I had so much to respond to in what you said. I'll first start by saying my older sister was born in 1989 when you wrote that book. And, I appreciate all the work that you've done and all of the people who built the movement up into the point, where it is today and where the youth have really taken it and run forward with it. We wouldn't have as much of a right, we'd still be arguing without your work, right? We'd still be arguing and we'd still be focused on the argument and not the fight. And what got me into the environmental movement is it really just stems from, I grew up in a desert, and I just moved from, after 10 years, well, let me just start. I grew up in a desert in California. So I think public school in California is like, care about the environment. So like one thing. So environment was like a value from the beginning. I'm like, yes, we should be like recycling, and like, yes, we should be protecting trees. And, because I was in the desert, I had never seen a real tree, up until I was 10.
Where were you? What county were you in? Where were you?
We were in the Mojave Desert.
Oh.
We were like 45. Excuse me, if you're familiar with military bases, Edwards Air Force Base.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that's where we were at, in the Mojave Desert. So I don't want to insult the trees I did see. There were Joshua trees. There were small trees. All trees matter. And so we want to make sure that, so when I moved from the desert to Georgia, that was my first time seeing a full stand of forest, a full stand of trees. Like, I had never seen anything like that. And I had never seen them as big as they were, as green as they were. And it was shocking because I had, internalized this thing that environment's important, but just seeing the contrast between these two different environments and how special each one of them is, and, wanting to just really protect that was something that got embedded in that move across the country. And so Georgia's just always going to be the place where my environmentalism was just, blossomed. And then further, there's just, as I grew up, I learned a lot about things that happened in the past, and where we are today. And especially as a woman of color in the South, a Black woman in the South, you know, learning about the civil rights movement and all of the work that was done so that I could just exist without fear, as you mentioned, with Ahmaud and Arbery, so that I could exist without fear. I could grow, I could thrive, I could do these wonderful things. And, you know, I didn't know what my future was going to be like. I still don't. I'm still pretty young. There's a lot of time ahead of me, God willing. And so, but what matters is somebody did the work so that my life would be better, right? And Maya Angelou, there's a quote that I'm sure we've all heard before, but it's, you know, do the best you can until you know better. Then when you do better, then when you know better, do better. And so that is just a fundamental value that I have, is that, you know, I don't want to insult the things that came before us, but we've learned from those things and we know what we could do better. So let's do better and let's keep growing, because somebody did that work for me in the civil rights movement. I want to do that work for the environment, and for the generations to come. And so, you know, I ended up in the movement because I was taking a public policy class. And once I realized your point that we had all the evidence, we had all the data, we had a set of solutions in front of us that could be pursued. It was simply just a matter of bad leadership. I knew I couldn't stand on the sidelines anymore. I needed to get involved. I needed to organize people. And I'm going to continue to do this work because it's not about me. It's about my kid. It's about her, hopefully kids, who knows, but you know, it's about the generation that comes after us. And so let's do better for them so they can do better.
That's a great quote from Maya Angelou. I'm just writing it down to remember it. That's really
Happy
something.
to repeat it. Do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. And that is, you know, so pervasive across all movements, whether we're talking about environment and, you know, sustainability and the way that we, you know, design our communities, or we're talking about racial justice, right? On the 1 year, you know, anniversary of Ahmaud's death, we definitely know better now. So let's commit collectively to doing better. That's one thing we can do.
Amen.
Save our future. So this is good stuff. So you talked a lot about the evolution of the environmental movement and how all of these different groups have come in to the movement. Sunrise, Extinction Rebellion, everybody's got their own sort of theory of change. The movement is becoming more diverse. Let's talk more about that change. How has the environmental movement changed since you first started? And of those changes, what are you most excited about? And what do you think presents the greatest challenge?
Well, you know, let's look, I mean, let's take a really long look and look back to the first Earth Day, uh, uh, which is, Megan said, we're 50 years on now. And back then, and thank heaven for the people, the pioneers who did that work then. We think they got 20 million people in the streets, 10% of the then population of the US on the first Earth Day. It was probably the biggest day of activism in US history. And that was enough to get us all the things that we still kind of rely on, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, that kind of thing, all signed by Richard Nixon, not because he was an environmentalist, anything but because he had no choice. They'd shifted the zeitgeist. And they'd done it because you could see the things that were going wrong. Rivers were catching on fire. Cities' air was so foul you couldn't see the sun, on and on and on. So they won those battles. And that's why we have something to work from. You know, if they hadn't fought and won those battles, we'd be in a very different place right now. But now we face this much deeper set of problems, of which climate change is the most emblematic, that really aren't exactly the result of something going wrong. They're just things going sort of the way they're supposed to, just at way too high, too much of them, I mean, carbon dioxide doesn't kill you. It doesn't turn the air black. It doesn't do anything like that. It just traps heat that would otherwise radiate back out to space. And there's no catalytic converter you can put on your car. you actually have to have a new kind of car and run it on electricity or take a bus, or you have to make, what I'm saying is now we have to make systemic changes, okay? And since we have to make systemic, not technical changes, we need a really different, we need a much more totalizing movement, you know? It can't be left in the hands of something called environmentalists, because it's not in the end a kind of environmental problem exactly. It's a problem about sociology and economics and psychology and 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 all of those things. And that's why we're seeing things like the Green New Deal that take, try to solve a lot of these issues at the same time, because we're going to have to in order to really get ourselves out of the fix we're in. Now, I think that the best thing that's happened with the environmental movement in recent years is the change in its kind of composition and leadership. When we look at polling data around this country and ask people about climate change, it's very clear who cares about it. Black Americans and Hispanic Americans, by very large margins, are the most concerned about climate change. And Indigenous Americans, although they don't always show up as much in the polls because they don't get asked, I'll just say in passing that one other reason this is an historic day and a really good one is that the first Native American nominee for a post in the cabinet ever, Deb Haaland, had her confirmation hearing today, and that was pretty special moment. She's an old friend, and I was really happy to see that. But that um, that kind of diversity makes it a much more powerful movement. There'll always be wonderful and important roots in the kind of conservation ideal, and in the kind of work that people are about tonight, making sure that the coastlines are protected or that forests are protected or so on and so forth. But we're now at a point where we can't do those things without huge economic interventions. I mean, when we think about the coast of Georgia, we've got to protect the land and the salt marshes and so on from development. But if we don't get climate change seriously under control, I mean, the average beach on the East Coast of the United States slopes inward at about 1 degree, which means that if you raise the ocean a foot, the ocean comes in 90 feet, and we're not raising the ocean a foot, we're going to raise it, 3, 4, 5, 6 feet just this century alone, so unless we get our act together very fast. So that's why it's been so important to have so many different kinds of people. And I really came to realize this when we started this fight a little more than a decade ago about the Keystone Pipeline, which was the kind of coming out party for a climate movement, and 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 it was so rousing to see how people managed to figure out how to work together. One of the highlights of that whole thing was when a lot of indigenous people and a lot of farmers and ranchers from along the pipeline route, places like Nebraska, came together in Washington. And I mean, this is not easy because basically these are the descendants of the people who stole the land from the other people, but there they are, working together. They called themselves the CIA, the Cowboy Indian Alliance, and that was, I can't begin to tell you how politically potent that was, so we need more of that, and it's and among other things, it just makes it all way more fun. Um, um, just because you're meeting and dealing with all different kinds of people. And the same thing goes all over the world. 350.org works all over the world. We've organized demonstrations in every country except North Korea. And, every place around the world, the same things apply. The less you did to cause the problem, the sooner and the harder you get hit. Solving it requires big changes in the economy, but those changes, if we do them right, will benefit most people but they'll always hurt the people who own oil wells and coal mines and things. So they're going to fight like hell. I mean, the story plays out the same almost no matter where you are.
Yeah, so I definitely hear that. I'm definitely a big fan of the growing diversity in the movement. I spend a lot of time talking about it. Personally with my friends and family, when I catch them at the dinner table and they'll listen. I spend a lot of time talking about the movement and it becoming more diverse and it needing to do that because what we're realizing is that environment can't be picked apart from the other major issues that we're facing. Of course, racial justice comes to mind because of our context, but we've got other class issues, et cetera, that overlap with climate and environment that if we're going to address thoroughly and comprehensively have to be addressed at the same time. And I have to say in my time in the environmental movement, particularly the word conservation, and hopefully I don't go on too much of a tangent on this, the word conservation. When I first saw the word conservation as a young environmental activist, it did not sit well with me. And I couldn't figure out why it did not sit well with me. Over time, I've come to learn because the connotation of that for me was that conservation was about protecting nature from people. It was about keeping the things separate, keeping people out of these pristine places so they could stay pristine, right? Protecting these places for plants and animals, but keeping people separate from it. And don't get me wrong, I know that there's important conservation plays an important role in protecting the biodiversity on this planet and the heritage that we all have in nature. But it separated people from environment as if these things were not connected. And so it was like, oh, we've protected 100 acres or 1,000 acres, and so we've done this great thing. But the biggest threat to that forest is climate change. It's not just people coming in and logging anymore, right? And so how do we solve climate? Well, we got to get into these much more intersectional conversations about energy production and where that energy is being produced and how that's being produced and who's working in that industry and how that production impacts them, especially if we change it. Right. Same thing with transportation, not, always the clearest environmental issue, but how we build our cities and how we move around our cities makes a huge difference for how many emissions we're putting out and how resilient we are to changing climate. Right. So when we're trying to get into this bigger intersectional problem, we have to be more diverse in who we're including in the conversation. We need people who are naturally going, well, what about the Black people? What about the Hispanic folk? Well, what about young people? We've got to have people who are inclined to ask those questions up front. And I want to say that I think the value of the moment that the environmental movement is that it hopefully is spilling over into other places as we try to figure out how to work more inclusively and to accommodate all of these voices. And I think that, people individually are coming into the movement and leaving with some really solid tools and perspective around race and justice and what that means for what they care about. So I feel like I got a lot of really good questions here in the chat that are related to this. And so I'm going to see if I can tackle. Well, I guess I'll tackle one, which is where do you see the environmental climate movement in another 25 to 50 years? And don't worry, other anonymous attendees, I have your questions. I will tackle them. But let's start with, where it was, how it's changed. Where do we want to see it go in 25 to 50 years, Bill?
Well, it's a very good question because time is the key element here. And, that's what makes climate change in particular such a vexed and difficult problem. Unlike a lot of things, if we don't solve it quickly, we don't solve it. I mean, I, there are plenty of other issues that are really important, like say, healthcare. And it's a sin that we don't have good healthcare system for a lot of people, and that they get sick or go bankrupt or whatever it is, you know. And we've got to fix it. And when we finally get around to fixing it, the fact that we didn't fix it for 20 years or 40 years or whatever won't make it that much harder to solve. Sadly, climate's not like that. If we don't solve it soon, then we never solve it because we go past these tipping points. Once you've fully melted the Arctic, there's no plan for refreezing it, you know? Once the sea level's gone up a few feet, there's no system for bringing it back down in anything under geologic time. And the time is even shorter than that 25 or 50 years that the questioner asks about. You know, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, our climate scientist body, told us in October of 2018 that if we hadn't fundamentally transformed our energy system by 2030, and they defined fundamentally transformed as cutting emissions in half, then the chances of meeting the targets we set in Paris just 6 years ago are by the board. You know, so the crucial time is the next 9 or 10 years. I think it's the period when we have maximum leverage over the outcome, and we wasted the last 4 years, obviously, and we've run out of time to waste. So we've got to work really fast now, and faster than is politically or comfortable and economically convenient. But the good news is that, you know, the one ace in the hole we have, besides this movement that we've built, is that the engineers have done a good job. And in the last 10 years, the price of a solar panel and the price of wind power have dropped about 90%. And so that's the one thing that sets us up for rapid success if we decided to. So if you went back to your, you know, home in the Mojave, what's happening there now is they're rolling out solar panels fast, you know. It turns out they have a great resource there called hot, bright sun and no clouds day after day after day. And so they're taking advantage of it. And we have to take advantage of that in every place that we possibly can. And if we do, I mean, I honestly think we're all going to have to meet together in 2030 and just kind of assess where we are and see where do we go from here. Have we made enough progress to begin to turn this around, to slow it down? And if we have, then good. And if not, then we've got a series of increasingly difficult choices to make about how we salvage anything.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. 25 to 50 years from now, we want the environmental movement to have been successful in its mission, right? To be pretty far along. But, you know, actually I'm going to jump forward to the last question I had, which was really about the sense of urgency that you're talking about, right? So yeah, 25 to 50 years from now, I would like to see us have really integrated environment and climate in all decision making, period. Like, we have got to stop thinking about this as something separate. When we're talking about healthcare, we're talking about environmental issues, we're talking about infrastructure, we're talking about environmental issues. It's sort of like racial justice, right? You can't just tackle it separately. It's you've got to really revisit the way you do everything. And that's a lot of work. But I think that, you know, asking the question, well, so how do we make sure that this is sustainable when we are planning to do anything, is the change I would like to see us make as a society. And hopefully the environmental movement is getting to a place, especially as we become more inclusive and more intersectional, where we're leaving that impression and that process with people.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And one way of saying it is that we got to stop thinking about environmental stuff, climate change, as kind of a problem on a list of issues to deal with. And instead, as you say, as a kind of lens through which to look at the world. The biggest lens for the last 100 years that we looked at the world through was, will whatever we're thinking about make the economy bigger or not? Like, if this will make people some money, if it'll, you know, grow the economy, whatever, then basically we did it. And that was and it, you know, depending on how you think about things, that paid off in a lot of ways. But it also set us up for enormous problems that we're now facing. our lens through which we have to look at the world now, you're absolutely right, is whatever we're thinking about is, can we do this in a way that helps us survive or not? And that should be the decision-making metric now. And that's a profoundly different world.
I agree, and thank you for crystallizing my words there. Absolutely, this is the lens through which we want to see. We should be thinking about the world. And so the question really came up. I was reading a poll that asked people. You mentioned not climate not being one issue in a list of issues. Where here's the problem: is people feel that way. And there was a poll that says even though people overwhelmingly believe that climate change is happening and they believe something should be done about it, there seems to be this sense of we've got plenty of time. There was something like let me see what that number was. It was 68% of the people who responded um, don't think it's too late to do anything about global warming. They think we have plenty of time. And even though we're like, yeah, no, I mean, once the Arctic melts, like you said, it's pretty accelerated from there. That's just not what people are getting. And I've got, to be frank, a lot of questions about conservatives in this chat. And we're in Georgia. Yeah, we went blue at the top of the ticket, but statewide down. I mean, it's
I
deep
know.
sea down here. So, I think that there are some Republicans and conservatives who are moving along on this issue who are like, okay, maybe climate change isn't so bad. But, again, that urgency that we've got plenty of time to deal with that. What do
So
you
the
think?
first, I mean, you're so right, Brionté. I mean, the first the first challenge that we've overcome finally is getting people to understand that there is a problem. And it was hard to overcome because the fossil fuel industry has mounted a 30-year, multi-billion-dollar effort to lie about it. The most organized and painful lie probably that human beings have ever told each other, because we knew 30 years ago what was going on. Nothing's changed in the science, but these guys, and they just went and hired everybody who'd worked for the tobacco industry and tried to, and succeeded in spreading the same. And we went from, and this is important for Republicans and conservatives to remember, we went from the place where in 1988 George H.W. Bush, Republican president, looked at the early data about all this and said, we're going to have to fight the greenhouse effect with the White House effect. He was serious about it, wanted to do something about it. We went from that 30 years of expensive lying from the fossil fuel industry to the point where the last Republican president of the United States said that it was a hoax invented by the Chinese and that the world was going to get cold sooner. And, I mean, so that was been difficult to overcome. But I think that kind of overt climate denial got on the plane with Trump and flew off to Mar-a-Lago. I don't think you're going to see that much more of that, even from conservatives, in the same way that you don't really see. I mean, we've shifted the zeitgeist, is what I'm trying to say. In the same way that even most conservatives don't bother arguing against gay marriage anymore because it's just a fait accompli. The world has shifted and we do that now. Now the problem is, as you say, convincing people that it's urgent and that we have to act now and swiftly. And that's here our ally in this work is Mother Nature, who is increasingly hitting us upside the head with a 2x4 to make the point. I mean, if 2020 hadn't been the year of the coronavirus, it would have been remembered as the year of the conflagration, because we had the biggest fires we've ever seen in Australia, in Siberia, in California, in South America. Just a world ablaze, and I think that that's beginning to get people to understand that we need change fast. The polling nationally showed that by last year, the number one issue for Democratic voters overall was climate change. And for young voters in both parties, the number one issue was climate change. And so it's beginning to sink in. But conservatives, I mean, I was thinking about this when you were talking about your problem with the word conservation. And one of my problems with the word conservative, and conservation derives from it, is that is that I never find conservatives as being serious about being conservative. I mean, if you were conservative, i.e., if you were a little worried about change and thought that we shouldn't go too fast and whatever, then your hair should be on fire about climate change, because there's nothing we've ever done as a species that is as radical as what we're doing now. We're changing the temperature of our planet and changing it dramatically and fast. I mean, you know, the guy who goes to work at the CEO of the oil company every day, um, um, he's the deepest radical in our society. The CEO who's trying to make his fortune, he's willing to alter the chemistry of the atmosphere. I mean, nobody in the 60s, no radical from the 60s was, thinking on that scale. Like, I mean, that's so our job, in a sense, is to be real conservatives and say, okay, you know what, we've got to slow down this change because it's just out of control. And sometimes you can convince people who think of themselves as conservatives to think like that. Increasingly, as you know, the military is really alarmed about climate change because they understand the instability that's going to come as people are set on the move around the world by drought and flood and storm. So sometimes that gets through to people. Or they look, I mean, they just look around and see that. I mean, I was just in Virginia Beach not long ago to visit my mother-in-law, and it was very clear that the huge naval shipyards and things are, they're going to be underwater in 10, 20, 30 years. So people are beginning to wake up. But man, it would help if they'd wake up a little bit faster, because time is, it was, we talk about we were good talk about our forebears in the civil rights movement. Dr. King used to say, the thing he'd say at every speech was the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice, which I think means this may take a while, but we're going to win. Okay. Which is comforting thought. Our problem is that the arc of the physical universe appears to be short and to bend toward heat. And so if we don't win soon, we don't win. Winning slowly on climate change is just another way of losing. So that's the part that scares me, and why it seems so urgent, and why I seem to keep ending up in jail and so on and so forth.
Yeah, so intense. I was just thinking about that quote today because we had a pretty significant environmental loss at the state capitol, and that was, yeah, I was definitely thinking about the moral arc of the universe. But you make a good point that we're on a on a physical planet here, and we are running out of time. And I guess just to answer this question directly about communicating effectively about the urgency without fear mongering, I find it's really important to connect the dots with what people are dealing with right now. People are really upset about COVID. So I talk about climate changing and the fact that we're going to have more incidents of disease, and it's going to be new crazy disease we've never seen before because climate is shifting in places. And that is one of the potential reactions for it. You're worried about COVID, you're worried about, COVID, we should be worried about climate. Or even on a more narrow, local area, that we've got data that shows that communities that had really high levels of air pollution suffered, deaths from COVID at a higher rate. So you have the slow burn of air pollution in your community, an environmental issue, right, that is exacerbating COVID. So if that's your biggest fear, environment's all up and through that.
Absolutely.
Right. If you're worried about jobs, we talk about the economy. We're going to talk about the potential for what a clean energy economy can bring. Right. All of these cool, new, exciting things when we're innovating, these new industries to invest in. I think you just have to really talk to people. Right. There's no like 1, 2, 3 that's going to get everybody. Like, it's a conversation that to be had, and listen to people and what they're saying, and just accept that some people are going to have tunnel vision on the first thing that's, look, I'm just trying to get my rent paid, right? there are people who are going to be very focused on that. But again, doing your best to connect the dots between their pressing current issue and the climate factors, I find is planting seeds for people
I
to
think
act
that's
on later.
I think that's brilliant. I think last year, I think the most important thing anybody said last year was what memorable thing anybody said, sadly, was what George Floyd said when he was dying, when he said, "I can't breathe," which is a pretty basic, I mean, that's about the most basic thing that a human can say. Um, People can't breathe because there's a racist cop kneeling on their neck. They can't breathe because there's a coal-fired power plant in the neighborhood. And we know whose neighborhood it's going to be. African Americans have 3 times the asthma rate of white Americans. People can't breathe because COVID is in their lungs. And you're right. If your lungs are already compromised, COVID's the worst. People can't breathe because the wildfire smoke has gotten so bad from the huge forest fires that the governor has said, go in your house and tape the windows shut so no more particulates can't get in. People can't breathe because it's gotten too hot. It reached 130 degrees Fahrenheit in California last summer, 120 degrees in San Luis Obispo, which is 5 miles from the ocean. It's never been anything like that before. It was 78 degrees Fahrenheit yesterday in Beijing, China, in the absolute dead of winter. It broke its old record by 10 degrees Fahrenheit. This is where we're supposed to be having the Winter Olympics next year at this time. Okay. Um, um, yeah, I mean, people can't breathe for a lot of reasons, and we have it within our ability to make it possible for people to breathe. I mean, that's the most human task anyone can think of. And these things, as you say, are knit together in a way that we have to go after now.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Just I'm gonna pivot a little bit because urgency. It's such a big topic. But like I said, just don't back away from the conversations. Have those conversations. Try to connect the dots with what people are going with, and know that you might not convert someone in that moment. From a non-believer to a believer, but every conversation, everything helps. Everything helps. The more that public opinion shifts and people are up talking about climate and taking action and the fact that it's urgent, the less acceptable it is for someone to not be on that wave, right? I think you said earlier about denialism, right? It's just people are no longer accepting outright denial of climate. So let's get people to a place where we're no longer accepting this idea that we have all this time in the world, right? Let's start talking about it and sharing it. I want to ask, do we think we could buy ourselves time with implementing some kind of artificial cooling technology, like injecting reflective materials into the upper atmosphere? This is actually not the first time I've heard this. Probably the first time I've heard this in a non-conspiracy theorist setting. But someone asked it, and I do think it's worth hitting.
No, I wrote about it last week in the New Yorker. In fact, I write this weekly free newsletter at the New Yorker for people who are really interested in climate stuff. It's easy to sign up for. And this last week's was about this. There are scientists who think that since we're not doing a good job of getting off coal and gas and oil, we're going to reach a point where we're going to have to fill the atmosphere with other chemicals to counteract the CO2. And the best guess probably is sulfur chemicals that would block some of the incoming sunlight. It would be like having a huge, constant, ongoing volcano erupting. You'd be flying them up or shooting mortar shells into the atmosphere around the clock with these chemicals. My friend Elizabeth Colbert's new book is called Under a White Sky. She writes about this, and the title comes from the fact that one of the things these chemicals may do is turn the blue sky white, kind of milky white, which, if you think about it, is kind of sad. These are nutty ideas, but they may be what if we don't do this job in the next 10 or 15 years, then the next generation of people may have no choice but to do horrible things like this. Now, one of the reasons that we don't want to do it is because it will do nothing to slow down the evil twin of global warming, which is ocean acidification. What all that carbon is doing, not in the atmosphere, but in the oceans. And if we keep burning coal and gas and oil, even if it didn't do anything to the temperature of the planet, the fact that it's altering the chemistry profoundly of the seas is an enormous topic, and one that, given our focus tonight along the Georgia coast, is one we should be talking about. I mean, uh, the 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 coral reef researchers are pretty clear that they're not going to be coral reefs left the way we know them in many more decades. And other ocean ecosystems are already starting to collapse. The great kelp forests of the southern hemisphere and of some of the Pacific coast, so on and so forth. We've got to slow down that too. And it's the same answer: stop burning stuff. If you had one rule of thumb, I mean, maybe two rules of thumb, it would be, we've got to stop burning things: coal, gas, oil, and also, and this is important in the Southeast, we've got to stop cutting down forests and turning them into wood pellets that we send off to Europe for them to burn in power plants. Because that doesn't help either. That's producing big pulse of carbon right now, and it's also wrecking forest communities, including in Georgia. That's the first rule. And the second rule is, don't build anything new that connects to a flame. So no pipeline, no new pipelines, no, whatever it is. We should be taking advantage of the fact that the good Lord installed a large fire 90 million miles away, and it's going to burn for the next couple of billion years. And we have solar panels that can capture its light, and we have wind turbines that can capture the power that comes from the differential and the heating from the sun of different parts of the world. That's what causes the wind. And when the wind blows, those turbines turn. They even work in the cold, despite what Ted Cruz is trying to tell you. In fact, most of the places where we have wind power is a lot colder than Texas. So it's really key that we do this work now and do it fast.
I hear all of that, and I feel like I just want to get up and what are the list of action alerts that I can click on and take right now? And I think that's really where everybody is when they hear, when the reality of climate change is, discussed and brought for them and brought forward, and these solutions, these tactics that we have to delay time, just, they don't save what we have now. They will still change a lot. And is that a change we really want? So I think people want to know, well, if we've got this limited, since we have this, not if, since we have this limited time frame, we need to take action, and we need to take action on two fronts. We need individuals to take action, and then we also need policy change. Like, we need our leaders to take action as well. So one of the questions I have is there any hope that there's going to be positive changes, or are there any hope that the positive federal changes will have staying power? Will we get the bipartisan support needed to continue that momentum? And not just at the federal level, but what about state level down? Do we think that momentum we're seeing at the federal level is gonna trickle? I hate the word trickle down for obvious reasons. Is it going to also light a fire and under the states to address this issue?
Well, so the first thing is, I doubt we're going to see serious bipartisan policymaking in Washington on this for a while. The Republican Party remains pretty much under the control of the fossil fuel industry. Their biggest donors by far have been people like the Koch brothers, who are the biggest oil and gas barons in the country. So it's hard to but I do think that the Biden administration is going to make lots of progress with executive orders and things that will be important in change. And I do think that we're more likely to get action at state and local levels, in part because people can see the effects more clearly there. They're not as insulated as people in DC are, and not quite as corrupted by the fossil fuel industry. And because all the solutions that we're talking about, happily, are things that pay off. You know, they create jobs. They also reduce eventually people's energy bills. They build economies that work for the long haul. Think about think about what Georgia would be without a kind of coastal tourist economy. You know, so people can sometimes see the realities more plainly when they're close to home. I will say that I don't think at this point individual action is a kind of key to how to get out of this, because we've waited so long that the math is hard to make work, one Tesla at a time, one vegan dinner at a time. And I'm happy that I have solar panels all over the roof and they connect to my electric car, and that's how I'm talking to you tonight, and blah, blah. But I don't try to fool myself. That's not how we're. The most important thing an individual can do is be a little less of an individual and join together with others in movements that make change. So the work that people are doing on the 100 miles of the Georgia coast is a perfect example, because I have no doubt that that part of that work is making sure that the state legislature is starting to take climate change seriously. The work that you've been doing with conservation voters couldn't be more important, because we got to be electing people at all levels of government that take this seriously. And we have to remember that political power is not the only power. We spend a lot of time pushing hard on Wall Street to get them to change too, because that's the other power source in our society. We've helped organize what's become the biggest campaign of its kind in history, this fossil fuel divestment movement. It's now at about $15 trillion in portfolios and endowments that have divested in part or in whole from fossil fuel. Now whole states are divesting their pension funds, New York State and others, big university systems, University of California, on and on and on. And so people are figuring out lots of ways to apply pressure. And that's what we got to be doing if we're going to make change in that period of time that we got. If we had 75 years, then we have a whole other conversation, Then things work really differently. Humans actually change much better when they go a little slowly, and have time to adapt. And some of us old people die off, and then the next people come along, and they're, that actually works a little better. But we don't have that time. We wasted our time, and just like we did with COVID, when we ignored it for 6 weeks, and by that point it was impossible to flatten the curve. The curve had gotten too steep. Well, the carbon curve is like that now. We have to really go to work in a kind of emergency basis.
Yeah, and I just want to impress upon people that, just everything you said is absolutely true. We as individuals need to take action, and that action is more than just making your individual choices at your home. I do think you should be making that choice, because money talks, right? Bill, you're talking about divestment campaigns. Actually, I want to say that the big call from 350 to divest from the fossil fuel industry impacted me at a very young age as I started investing. And so, I've got jobs and I had these 401ks and stuff. So I was like, oh, well, where's my money going? And so I had all of these questions, because your money is a vote, right? So whether we're talking about the products that you buy in your house, or you use to construct your house, or your investment and your retirement portfolios, your money matters, and keeping it out of the fossil fuel industry is really important.
And Fred, we made your money too, because the fossil fuel industry did terrible the last 10 years. It was the worst performing part of the economy. So you've got more money in your retirement account now than you would have if you hadn't paid attention to all that. Good for you.
Yeah, bet on the future. Bet on the future. That's what the stock market's about. And the future is not in fossil fuels. So, I think that we should make sure that if you've got your accounts, go home, check them out, figure out where your money's going. Somebody asked, what can you do? Well, look at your investment accounts as a first step. And the other vote that's really important is actually voting, definitely going to check that box in local races. In Georgia, we had, 3 runoff races in January, on January 5th. And we had the 2 Senate races that everybody in the nation knew about, but we had a 3rd race, the Public Service Commission. It was a really important seat. They regulate Georgia Power. And Georgia Power is investing tons of money in dirty energy. Energy that is just simply not harm-free. And so, if we do not vote in these down ballot races, we are missing opportunities to get pro-climate champions in office, right? So, yeah, we've got the top of the ticket. That was great. We got pro-environment champions, and Biden and John Ossoff and Reverend Warnock, but we failed to do that on the Public Service Commission. We got someone that's, pro, yeah, let's do some things, but the sense of urgency is not there. He's content to slow walk it, and that is not, what the moment calls for. So, please vote, and please vote in these down ballot races. And if you are a conservative or if you're a Republican, talk to other conservatives and Republicans about this as much as you can. Tell your stories. I just think it's important that they hear from people that think like them.
If you happen to be like I am, a Christian too, then that goes double for you. I think one of the best things that happened in that Georgia race was electing Reverend Warnock, not just because he comes out of Martin Luther King's pulpit, which is a pretty great commentary on American history, but because it's really, really important to get people of faith deeply energized in this work. And it's been good to watch it start to happen. And now it has to happen more and more really strong. The greatest environmental leader in the world may be the Pope, whose work on this stuff has been amazing. And now that's, trickling down into Protestantism and into other religious groups as well. But in a place like Georgia, in the Bible Belt there, really important to remind people that, we're supposed to be doing what we can to preserve creation, and we're not doing it now.
Yeah. And so absolutely, we had some questions come in the chat about that. The faith community is huge. It plays an important role. We've got great organizations like Georgia Interfaith Power and Light that are really organizing the faith community. And so, definitely talk about that with your fellow churchgoers and your fellow believers, and talk about the mission of protecting creation, being good stewards of the earth that God gave us. It's the only one I know, and I think we should take care of it. And so, again, all those conversations, when they're with someone who they see as a peer, someone who they see as a colleague, someone, that they see shares the same beliefs and values that they have, it's going to go a lot further than, someone they perceive as shouting at them across some ideological aisle, right? So, don't be shy from having those conversations, and, just the act of discussing it, even if you don't convince them right away, is enough. Interrupting that, thought that it's okay to just, act like this isn't a problem. Interrupting that is powerful. So please continue to talk. Please use your faith, and conservatives, please talk to other conservatives about this issue as much as possible. I know we got less than 7 minutes. I'm trying to tackle some things in the questions, because these were, I have to say, y'all, fantastic questions. And so I'll tackle one. If, what advice would you give to the next generation of climate activists? What's one thing you wish you'd known sooner?
Well, I actually don't have any advice for the next generation of climate activists. I think you all are doing it just right. I think young people, when I started 350.org, I did it with 7 college students, and it was a kind of beginning of some of this youth climate activism. But now that youth climate activism is running the show. We helped with the big climate strikes in September of 2019, And there were 500,000 people in the streets in city after city after city, almost all of them young. Young people are getting this. They understand. I mean, I'm going to be dead before the absolute worst of this hits, but you're not, Brionté. You're going to be absolutely prime of your life. And instead of doing whatever it is, you're just going to be responding to emergencies unless we get this right and soon. So it's not young people, I think, that truthfully, I think if you look at the polling and everything, the people we got to go to work on are old people. And, you know, that's the political and financial power there because they all vote all the time, all of us. And we have, you know, ended up with a lot of the money and assets and retirement accounts and all of that. And it's really time for us, not because we're scared about our own futures, but because we understand that we're about to be the first generations to leave the planet a worse place than we found it. And that's a pretty horrible legacy to contemplate, you know. So that's I'm doing most of my organizing now, trying to start focusing on older Americans, although we need experienced Americans, we're calling them, because that's who's got to be answering this call. It's wonderful that Greta Thunberg is out there. She's one of my favorite people to work with. I adore her. It's even better that there are 10,000 Greta Thunbergs in every high school and junior high school around, and that they've got 10 million followers. But by the very nature of power in our society, there is a limit to what 18-year-olds and 23-year-olds and 29-year-olds and things can do to change things. It's going to take other people answering that call to let it really happen. This is such a question of, as you said, intersectional justice, intergenerational justice, because we're talking about every generation after ours if we leave this planet a poorer place. We're talking about justice between even species, because we're going to wipe out half the things that share this planet with us in this century unless we really get our act together. All those questions about justice should weigh really heavily on us and be a good spur to go to work, to do the difficult, you know. And sometimes I think people, you know, get a little like, well, it's too hard, or, you know, it's too much, we have to do too much. I mean, you know, our parents and grandparents, the challenge in their time was fascism in Europe, you know, and people had to cross the ocean and kill or get killed in order to keep the Hitlers of the world from, well, we don't have to go kill anybody and nobody's going to come shoot at us, but we do have to do work with the same kind of seriousness of purpose that people did in those times, because we've got a crisis on our hands too, and one that will last for many, many thousands of years if we don't handle it soon.
Yeah, and I would say that, you know, my advice to the next generation is really what I was saying earlier about down ballot races. One thing I wish I'd known sooner, right? Like, I really thought that if we just elect the president, it'll be all right. It'll be great. But it's not. You know, we have, you know, our U.S. senators, we have our Congress people at the federal level, and then we have at the state level down, you've got your governor, your lieutenant governor that you vote on, various secretaries, like your Secretary of Agriculture. You've got your mayor, your city council people, your county commissioners. I know it's a lot. But each and every one of these people has a role to play and has authority over the kind of world that we live in. So, you know, please vote in these down ballot races and take the time to educate yourself on what these races do. And my other thing is to vote in primaries, y'all. We gotta, you know, like, we're talking about partisan divides. Like, I'd like to see pro-environment Republicans run against less pro-environment Republicans. They can argue about everything else. I'd love to see where, you know, Republicans get primaried by pro-environment Republicans. Like, I want to see that. So vote in your primaries and pick out the candidates that are going to be most reflective of the comprehensive set of issues. You can scrap it out in your primaries. You know,
could you start with Miss Taylor Greene, please? That'd be a good one to start with. And in my distant opinion from up in Vermont.
She's an interesting person, you know, and you know what would be interesting is a primary between her and another well-educated Republican who, you know, wants to address climate. Like, I want to see
Absolutely.
that, you know, there are conservatives that believe climate change and
Absolutely.
environment is important. And I think that the Republicans have given that up and not decided not to have that debate amongst themselves. And I think that Republican primaries are the best place to do it, just like Democratic primaries are the place to talk about people who claim to be pro-environment because they're Democratic, but don't act that way, because that happens. They vote against those things all the time. So
Yep.
exactly, you know, it's both sides of the aisle need to be held accountable to this. So vote in primaries. I think that's really important. Pay attention to the primaries, put your pressure on those candidates, and then vote down ballot. That's my advice to the next generation. So we got a minute, and someone asked if we could leave the audience with a question. My question is, what are you investing in? Check out your stock portfolios. That's my question. Take that to the next level. Bill, you got a question you want to leave people with?
I think my question is, have you been keeping any of your powder dry? Because we really have reached the point where we need people all in. We need people out of their comfort zone because the planet's out of its comfort zone. And that'll mean different things for different people. Not everybody can go to jail, you know. Though it turns out I gotta say, it's not necessarily the end of the world. The end of the world is the end of the world. And that's why we need to do some stuff. But everybody can figure out what takes them out of their comfort zone. And that's where we got to go now in the next few years. So I try to ask myself that hard all the time. What are the things that are hard for me that keep me from being as effective as I can, and try to be honest with myself. I'm so grateful to you, Brionté. This has been a really, really fun conversation. So grateful to the people at 100 Miles for the work that they're doing. I've been down on some of those gorgeous islands and barrier beaches and things, and they're one of the treasures of the whole continent. And and we've got to save them from development, and we've got to save them from a rising ocean. Um, so we got a lot of work to do um, if we're going to keep that gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous low country there looking the way it does. So many thanks to everybody. Um, yeah, it's a fight, um, um, but there are days when I can almost convince myself we're going to get there. And January 5th was one of those days, staying up late to watch the returns coming in from all across the state of Georgia and realizing that people had opted um, um, for the future. I got to say, I didn't know it was going to happen. I hoped, but I was so happy to see it. And I know that your work was really important and everybody else there. So many, many thanks.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Bill. Georgia did that for everyone, and we still got some work to do, so don't leave us behind. Okay, I'm done.
No, it's good. I'm dropping in just to thank you both for an amazing conversation. I just want to leave the audience with a summary of one of the things that you both talked about for quite a bit, which is the quote by Maya Angelou, which is, do the best you can until you know better. And when you know better, do better. And just to, remind everybody that we all lived through 2020, which was a crazy year for a lot of the reasons that you referenced. And I think it taught us a lot. It opened our eyes in lots of different ways. And I think now we know a little differently than we did before 2020, and it's time to do better. We know better now, so it's time to do better. And like you said, we're on this track of doing, learning, and then doing better, and then doing, learning, and then doing better. And I think that's just what we have to do. So I appreciate your time and your thoughts tonight. And I'm going to show a couple of slides for the next week's conversation, but I know our audience loves to being part of the conversation, and I just want to express my gratitude. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all. What a pleasure.
So as y'all know, our conference is 5 weeks long, And I'm going to show you the slides for the next week. We only have one session left. We've been through 4, and it's amazing. I can't believe it's gone so fast. Next week, we'll have a conversation with Gus Speth, Jonathan Alter, and Jason Carter, and they will be talking to us as individuals about how we can make a difference. And they'll be doing that by discussing the life of one of Georgia's most influential residents, former President Jimmy Carter, who famously said, "I have one life and one chance to make it count for something. My faith demands that I do whatever I can, wherever I am, whenever I can, for as long as I can, with whatever I have to try to make a difference." It promises to be a wonderful conversation. And finally, as we've done every week, I want to remind you to go online to our website or our social media channels where you can find additional resources. Get involved with 100 Miles and learn more about the coastal stories that you want to tell. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and have a great night.